We are Potawatomi. We have always lived here. We used to build our homes, wigwams, near the St. Joseph River.
The St. Joseph Potawatomi hunted deer and buffalo, grew corn, beans, and squash, harvested wild rice. Mostly clustered in villages along the river near Niles, though archaeological maps show native settlements scattered throughout Berrien County, Indian burial grounds as well. And the Potawatomi traveled to seasonal hunting grounds as far away as Chicago. They'd come to the area in the late 1600s, enjoying good relations with French fur traders.
The Indians of the lakes are peaceable, and they will meet you in the forest with the French words of salutation, bonjour.
Actually, the Potawatomi's greeting was simply similar to bonjour, but it sounded friendly to the French. In the late 1700s, the fledgling U.S. government wanted to civilize Native Americans, impose European-style religion, education, and agriculture on them. But that changed when the War of 1812 ended, and the Erie Canal opened a decade later. Settlers poured into Michigan. Population in the state's southern counties tripled between 1820 and 30. The federal government now wanted the Indians out so settlers could move in. Potawatomi had to give up their lands, which once stretched from Detroit to St. Louis, in a series of treaties over 26 years. Most of southern Michigan ceded in 1821, the Indians forced to move west of the Mississippi. The St. Joseph Potawatomi feared they'd be next to go when Pokagon became their chief in 1826. Probably Odawa or Ojibwe by birth, Pokagon had married the daughter of Topnabi, the chief of the St. Joe Potawatomi, for 40 years. After Topnabi died, Pokagon became chief, a born leader.
A natural orator,
said one who knew him.
He spoke with great deliberation, making graceful, easy, effective gestures.
Pokagon's oratory and strategic thinking would help his people avoid removal to the west through religion. Many missionaries were trying to convert, or as they put it, civilize Indians. A Baptist preacher, Isaac McCoy, had established a mission among the St. Joseph Potawatomi in 1822. But McCoy proved to be an inadequate partner and came to favor the government's policy of removing Indians to the west to keep them away from alcohol, he said. So Pokagon went to Detroit, begging Catholic Father Gabriel Richard to send a priest, a black robe in Pokagon's words, to his people.
Father Richard initially rejected him, but then he appealed to him and actually recited the Lord's Prayer and the Credo and some other prayers in the Anishinaabe language.
It worked. Father Stephen Baden, the first Catholic priest ordained in the U.S., established a mission and school in Pokagon's village in 1830. Baden's records show 650 Potawatomi baptized within 5 years. Leopold Pokagon and wife Elizabeth among the first and most devout.
He is a man full of good sense, of honest heart,
wrote Father Baden.
Pokagon is constantly at work with both soul and body. He is truly a Christian orator.
Pokagon's followers also soon adopted plowing and other farming techniques the Catholic priests taught them. Archaeological excavations at Pokagon's village near Niles showed far more evidence of domesticated animals and European ceramics than in other Potawatomi settlements. Some researchers say geography played a role.
Leopold Pokagon and his people were at the crossroads for a long time.
They lived near major early roads and trails, and near a key portage between the St. Joseph and Kankakee rivers. Exposure to settlers and the commerce they brought may have made it easier for Pokagon and his people to adjust to European ways than it would have been for more isolated Indians. Pressure mounted all around Pokagon. Indian lands were being signed away in lopsided treaties.
The message was pretty clear, was that you either come and negotiate your best deal for your removal, or we're going to take the land anyway.
By 1830, only the St. Joseph Potawatomi still held tribal lands in Michigan. But in 1833, Potawatomi chiefs were called to Chicago for more treaty negotiation. Chicago, a modest village at the time, was flooded with thousands of tribal leaders. and with federal negotiators employing alcohol to their advantage.
The federal government used whiskey as a part of its treaty negotiation process or prelude across the continent.
Alcohol clouded the judgment of many Potawatomi chiefs, but devout Catholic Leopold Pokagon did not drink and made novel arguments against removal.
They could rely on both their Catholicism and their farming to promote the idea that they're living just like their neighbors.
Pokagon's strategy worked. Most chiefs signed a treaty on September 26, 1833, that mandated removal to Kansas. The next day, Pokagon and a few other chiefs signed a separate deal.
Leopold's band in Michigan was allowed to stay, according to the wording of the treaty, was on account of their religious creed.
Pokagon then took treaty payments and bought nearly 900 acres of land near Dowagiac. He and his people moved there and settled in. But the federal government took one last crack at removal. General Hugh Brady was dispatched to expel Michigan's remaining Native Americans in 1840. Pokagon, though, pled his case to Michigan Supreme Court Justice Epaphroditus Ransom, with success.
The judge informed me
General Brady would write,
he should be bound to relieve them from any forcible effort made to emigrate them.
Pokagon had successfully resisted removal.
He ensured our future on our homeland by protecting us, by playing the white man's game.
Pokagon's people avoided the arduous journey west that cost many Potawatomi lives. Leopold Pokagon died shortly after Justice Ransom blocked removal. Pokagon was buried in Dowagiac on the site where Sacred Heart of Mary Church now stands. But the tribal community there soon fell apart in disputes over ownership of land. The name Pokagon, though, remained prominent. Leopold's son Simon became one of the best-known Native Americans in the country, though even today not revered among his own people.
People didn't really talk about Simon a lot, and if they did talk about Simon Pokagon, it wasn't generally in glowing terms.
Simon was just 8 when his father signed the treaty in Chicago, a place he recalled fondly for reporters as a spring and fall hunting ground during his boyhood. He was an author, sometimes called the Indian Longfellow, much celebrated in the press as the best educated Native American in the country, and highly regarded by Chicago elites.
These friends of Indians needed an Indian to be friends with. Simon was willing to be their friend.
He called himself Chief Pokagon, though he never formally held the title. Simon did pursue treaty money owed the Potawatomi, visiting Abraham Lincoln shortly after his election, and Ulysses S. Grant when he was president. Eventually, money was paid, $39,000 to tribal members in 1866, another $104,000 in 1893. Some suspected Simon Pokagon used treaty payments to enrich himself unfairly.
He was kind of a dicey guy.
A big self-promoter, but not a crook, concludes Pokagon Band member Professor John Lau.
He never sold the tribe down the river.
Still, the history page on the Pokagons' website makes no mention of Simon, who once wrote,
I have stood all my life between the white people and my own people. Without gun or bow, I have stood between the two contending armies, receiving 1,000 wounds from your people and my own.
Simon's fame reached its height at Chicago's Columbian Exposition of 1893. A World's Fair Simon decried in a book printed on birch bark, initially entitled Red Man's Rebuke, which begins,
We have no reason to celebrate with you the great Columbian Fair.
The book, later retitled Red Man's Greeting, was sold at the fair to great acclaim.
It was full of indignation,
Wrote one reviewer,
but also free from vindictiveness. No one can read it without realizing the other side of the Indian question.
the prevailing view of the Indian question was on dramatic display at the Chicago Fair. Buffalo Bill's Wild West show depicted cowboys valiantly vanquishing bloodthirsty Indians. Pokagon's book provided a powerful counter-narrative.
The pale faces came by chance to our shores, many times very needy and hungry. We nursed and fed them, fed the ravens that were soon to pluck out our eyes. Before the white man came among us, we were kind, outspoken, and forgiving. Our real character has been misunderstood because we have resented the breaking of treaties. Was there ever a people without the slightest reason of offense, more treacherously imprisoned and scourged than we have been?
Mayor Carter Harrison invited Simon Pokagon to play a major role in Chicago Day at the fair, an event attended by 750,000 people. Pokagon was invited to ring a replica of the Liberty Bell, referee a lacrosse game, and ride on a parade float depicting Native Americans in Chicago, dressed in full chief's attire. Simon gave the mayor a ceremonial deed for the land his forefathers had been forced to relinquish, and spoke conciliatory words.
We must teach our children to give up the bow and arrow that is born in their hearts, and in place of the gun, we must take the plow and live as white men do.
But later, Simon bitterly described his ride on the fair's giant Ferris wheel.
I surveyed the white man's Chicago, but how unlike the Pokagon of the red man. All had changed except the sun and the sky above. They had not, because the Great Spirit in his wisdom hung them beyond the white man's reach.
Pokagon, his reputation burnished by his World's Fair appearance, spent his final years writing a book, Queen of the Woods, a love story that tracked the author's real life. Pokagon even put his love story with wife Lonida into song lyrics. The novel was published after Simon's death in 1899. Despite all the praise and headlines, Simon died as he lived in poverty. Land claims he had pressed had come to naught, though one major claim was still being contested. Simon and others had argued because Chicago had added several acres of landfill along the lakefront after the treaty with the Potawatomi, that newly created land belonged to Native Americans. But the U.S. Supreme Court unanimously shot down that claim in 1917.
It was too expensive. It was going to cost too much. The only thing people hate more than Indians are rich Indians. You know, that's what my grandma always said.
When other tribes were granted recognition and federal aid under the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, the so-called Indian New Deal, the Pokagons' application was denied. Tribe members went through decades of frustrating red tape trying to gain tribal recognition.
Invariably, the paperwork that we'd spent 6 months getting together would get lost, or they would move the goalposts.
In the early 90s, the Pokagons got their congressmen involved. Tim Romer of Indiana and Fred Upton of Michigan helped push through the Pokagon Recognition Act. President Bill Clinton signed it into law in September 1994. Rhonda Purcell's aunts were there. Even at 9,
I could just feel the excitement that this was very important, this was serious.
not only did tribal recognition provide a morale boost, it also brought the Pokagons low-interest loans and other federal assistance. And casinos. The first in New Buffalo opened in 2007. Others have followed, immensely profitable. The tribe has used the proceeds to provide housing and health care and education.
What am I saying?
Some Pokagons study Potawatomi, a language very few still speak, though a language that is all around us.
Chikaming comes from the word Jik-Gamik, which means place by the water.
Dawagayak, and that means place where you scoop out of the water.
Jiganak means a place where the land's been scraped clear.
And Pokagons gather for powwows, celebrating traditions largely uprooted over the generations after settlers swept west and imposed European culture on tribes.
The drum is the heartbeat of our nation. I think it gives the people a sense of place and a sense of culture, a sense of community pride. I'm very proud to be a Pokagon and to be in today's world.